This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
I would like to introduce our next speaker as Dr. Ryutaro Hirose. I think some of you might remember Ryo, who had a masterful performance last year in the debate on HCC and kind of blow us off the planet, even though Neil Mehta and I had pretty good data. So that's the reason that Ryo is not doing a debate this year. Instead, Ryo is going to talk about fair organ allocation. It's a fitting topic for Ryo, as Ryo is serving as the Associate Director of UNOS and is going to be the next UNOS Director. So talking about debate, I'm sure that Ryo has done very well in all these heated debates when it comes to national policies for organ allocation. So this is a really important topic, and Ryo is really the best person to share this information with us. And just one other quick thing, that as if his plate is not full enough, he's also the Associate Surgical Residency Director, and he's a very active clinical surgeon as well, doing a lot of the HCC work for us, and it's been delightful to work with. So, Ryo?
Just a slight correction, I don't direct all of UNOS. I'm just the vice chair of the Liver Intestinal Committee for UNOS, and so I will be involved. I'll be the upcoming chair of this committee. The role of the committee actually is to create organ allocation policy for this country for liver allografts and intestinal allografts. And it's an interesting committee to be on because there's a lot of representation from all over the world, all over the country. And obviously we have heated debates as to what is the right thing to do. Just the purpose of this presentation, I wanted to go over where we've been, where we are right now in terms of organ allocation distribution, and what the thinking of how to fix some of these problems that we have for the future and some of the obstacles involved. But just as a little bit of a history lesson, the first successful liver transplant was done in 1967, and back then, in 1968, the Southeast Organ Procurement Foundation was formed as a membership and scientific organization for transplant professionals. And in 1977, 10 years later, they actually implemented the first computer-based organ matching system. They called it United Network for Organ Sharing, that matched organs with recipients. 1984 was a hallmark year in that the U.S. Congress passed NOTA. NOTA is the National Organ Transplant Act, and then they established what's called the OPTN as a contractor to the government, the Organ Procurement and Transplant Network. And their role in the contract was to maintain, one, a national list of candidates, two, to establish a national system to match organs with the candidates, and to assist OPOs, organ procurement agencies, in the nationwide distribution of organs equitably among transplant patients. We'll get back to that word in just a second. In 1986, the UNOS, actually now separated completely from the Southeast Organ Procurement Foundation, is now a nonprofit member organization that receives the federal OPTN contract, and UNOS has actually held on to the contract ever since then. They've had several renewals, and they still remain the OPTN contractor. Now, originally, liver distribution was not a big deal in that there was very few liver transplant centers. As liver transplant centers grew, then there had to be a distribution system that allowed organs to end up in different centers. But the basic system was, first, it was offered to whatever local area that the liver occurred in. So whatever was closest, that center would have the first dibs on that organ. Then it went regionally, a little bit larger, then it went nationally, and they were listed in a very complex system of severity points, illness points, and points were actually, a fair number of points were added depending on the proximity of the donor to the transplant center. So the closest you were, you had more points, and this favored local use of the organ, which was a good thing in that it minimized cold ischemia time. But these point systems could be bypassed by any center saying, oh yeah, this is a stat patient, I need a liver stat. And some centers used this frequently, others didn't, and so there was a disparity in where the organs actually went. Since that time, there was a distribution system that was in place for quite a long time where we only had 3 or 4 categories of patients. Status 1 was the acute liver failure patient. Status 2A and 2B were hospitalized patients either in the ICU or on the floor. And they were actually ordered according to things like ascites and encephalopathy, very subjective things. And so centers could sort of manipulate or game the system, put people in the ICU, all sorts of things. And there were many patients at the same status. So of all the patients at status 2B, how would they be ordered? Well, they would be ordered by waitlist time at that status. So basically it was a first come, first serve once you were in that status. In addition, geographic proximity took center stage, because once you were in a category of 2B, they were ordered by waitlist time, but they were offered to the local area first before they went regionally. So the local area, and by local area, I mean an area that is determined by what's called the DSA, or the donor service area of an organ procurement agency. As I'll show you, these lines don't make any sense. And actually they do represent lines of death for many of our patients. In recent history, the U.S. Department of HHS actually published different final rules for the operation of the OPTN, and so changes were made to use the MELD score to allocate liver allografts, which is obviously a continuous score. And part of the final rules, these are the components, some of the components of the HHS final rules, that the allocation policy shall, 1, seek to achieve the best use of donated organs. 2, shall be designed to avoid wasting organs, to avoid futile transplants, to promote patient access to transplantation, and to promote the efficient management of organ placement. And importantly, shall not be based on the candidate's place of residence or place of listing. So I would submit we have failed on this last goal in a big way, and that we are trying our very best to try to meet this final rule, which has been in place for about a decade, actually more than a decade. So what about sickest first? Well, this is the philosophy that the liver allocation system uses, is sickest first. The setting the priority ranking is that shall be ordered from most to least medically urgent, and that there shall be a sufficient number of categories, if categories are used, to avoid grouping together patients with substantially different medical urgency, which was the case under the old system of 2A and 2B. So there was many patients that would either die very quickly or not die quickly at all that were all in the same status. So that really didn't make a lot of sense. And MELD actually has pretty much achieved this one goal. But what about other things that determine how we should use scarce resources? There's this demand to supply ratio, which is very different depending on what part of the country you're talking about. Now, transplantation is one of the only fields in medicine that truly rations medical care. Everyone talks about being conscious of resources that are used, but transplantation, since we do have such a scarce resource, we have selection committees. We have people who determine whether someone's a transplant candidate or not. They may be patients that might benefit a little bit from transplant, but we decide that the benefit from them is not good enough to actually use a precious organ. And so when we look at organ allocation policies, we balance often very conflicting principles. The conflicting principles include utility, that is, the maximizing the usefulness of a scarce resource, efficiency, and that goes to both efficiency in cost and value. So cost efficiency, it may not be the most cost efficient to transplant the sickest patients. And then there's justice, which may actually go against either one of these principles, which is a sense of fairness and a sense of equity and a sense of equal access for all candidates. So these are the things that one must balance when you write organ allocation policy. And so the allocation schemes are different right now in this country according to what organs you're even talking about. So how the patients are ordered, which is allocation as opposed to distribution. In liver, we still do sickest first. We do not look at the post-transplant outcomes, and we can argue, is that really a good system or not? I would argue that's actually working pretty well, even though we don't necessarily have the post-transplant outcomes in the allocation scheme. Actually, the lung transplanters do use it. They use a ratio of years added with a transplant, that is post-transplant survival, a ratio between that and the mortality pre-transplant without having a lung transplant, which is the waitlist mortality. They use that ratio to come up with a lung allocation score, and then they distribute organs according to that. Now, the kidney transplant allocation system, again, has largely based on waiting time, first come, first serve. You get some points for being sensitized, you get some points for certain things like being a kid, and a lot of points if you're a foreign or living donor. But basically, it's a first-come, first-served basis, which in a way might seem fair and equitable, but it isn't really if you look at referral patterns, et cetera. And it certainly isn't based on anything who's going to die first on the kidney waiting list. Now, the MELD system obviously went into place, and you all know how to calculate that. It's capped at 40, and it's relatively accurate in predicting 3-month waitlist mortality in liver transplant recipients. So the way it works in terms of sickest first, status 1 patients still get priority. Then goes MELD score from 40 on down. But obviously, there's many patients that don't really get reflected by their MELD score in terms of how urgent they need a transplant. So we've made exceptions to some of these cases, including, very importantly, HCC. Now, we've actually gotten that wrong, too. We've given HCC patients way too many points, and that's been the case, and we've tried to ratchet it down each time, and we haven't ratcheted it down just enough yet. But I think we're getting there, and we will get there soon. But right now, as it stands, the HCC patients enjoy much larger access to transplants than the non-HCC patients, as reflected by the disparity in the waitlist mortality and the dropout rate if you look at HCC patients versus non-HCC patients. Now, this is a map that doesn't make sense. This is a map of the OPO boundaries and the DSAs, each color representing a DSA. Not only are these DSAs very different in size and population and donor number and patient number, they also aren't even contiguous. So look at Texas. If a donor happens in a brown area, it has to go to a center in the brown area. So you could see that a center in the blue area could not get access, even though they're much closer than some of those other centers, based on a lot of politics, based on things that didn't have no bearing on patient survival. You can see little patchworks, that little spot in Sacramento that is the Golden State OPO when they used to have a liver transplant center. A patient in that little area would have access to a liver way before a patient in the San Francisco Bay Area, for example, and they could transplant a patient when they had one with a MELD of 15 or so when our patient with a MELD of 40 is dying in the ICU. And that is or was the allocation system up till very recently when we went to regional sharing for status 1, and most recently we invoked a role called Share 35, which I'll get into. Now, beyond these 58 DSAs, there are 11 UNOS regions. And this is important to know because the next step beyond the DSA is the UNOS region. So we're in Region 5, and you can see how big that is, compared to Region 1 or Region 2. And although the population densities are actually quite different, actually per square mile, so that there are actually a fair number of lives in Region 1, 9, and 2, it also doesn't make sense in terms of how many donors across this country there are. There's a disparate number of donors that occur based on overall death rates from accidents, death rates from strokes. There's a huge swath across the Southeast called the stroke belt. Many of you are aware of this. And there's huge numbers of deaths in that stroke belt. And so there's a fair number of donors that are available in that area. And those areas actually correspond to sometimes things like MELD score transplant, which are lower in that area in general than our area. So how does organ distribution rules apply right now today? Well, we just invoked Share 35, and the reason why we did that is several years before, we invoked that the status 1 patients should get more access to a wider area of livers because of their urgency, their need for transplants. So status 1 patients went to a regional list first. In other words, the local folks did not all have access to these livers before the region had access for their status 1 patients. It turned out that the patients that are listed from MELD 35 to 40 have at least or very similar mortality to status 1 patients. And actually, the longer they're at their own status, the status MELD 35 to 40 patients have a higher mortality than the status 1s. So that a policy went through called Share 35, which many people in the country are very upset about. What happens is that if there's a MELD 35 to 40 patient in the region, that liver gets allocated to that regional patient, so it doesn't stay locally, at least for the patients from 35 and above. However, if there isn't a patient that's appropriate for that liver, it then goes back to that local DSA, that first map I showed you, and those local centers and that local DSA where that donor is located has access to the liver for every single patient with a MELD of 15 to 34. Only if the centers in that local DSA turn it down for every single patient that has a MELD 15 to 34 does it go back to the UNOS region for all patients above 15. And then if that doesn't happen, then it goes status 1 national, MELD greater than 15 national. So even if we had a liver that was literally in Oregon, just across the Oregon border, we'd have to wait till it goes national before we would even hear about it for our status 1. In other words, all the patients in the Oregon centers, Washington, would have to refuse it for every single patient above a MELD of 15 before we would hear about it in our area for a status 1 patient or for a status patient that has a MELD of 40 dying in our ICU. So the Share 35 policy was meant to be an extension of regional fairing for status 1. It really was not designed to fix geographic disparity. It did expand access to livers for the sickest patients. And the patients with a MELD score of 35 in the country have a greater than 33% risk of dying in a year, but this is a sort of deceiving number because the mortality of these patients are hugely different depending on where you live, and I'll get into that in just a second. What has Share 35 done? This policy actually has accomplished all of its intended goals. More patients with MELD greater than 35 are getting more offers. They're getting transplanted. They're getting the transplant earlier. So far, there's no deleterious decrease in outcomes, which was one of the arguments that were made against this policy. We're going to shunt more and more livers to the sickest patients, so you're going to have worse outcomes. The same argument was actually made when MELD was actually first invoked, in that if you do sickest patients first, you're going to be wasteful. You're going to be doing futile transplants, and the patients are going to do worse. In fact, the data contradict that. After MELD went into place, the results for liver transplantation in this country got better, not worse. So it probably turns out that we are not the stupidest people in the world. We can figure out who's too sick to transplant, and we don't transplant them, especially if we do a few of them and then, figure out that, that guy was too sick to transplant. There's been no increase in discards either. We talked about, greater length of travel, and we were worried about increasing discards, and that hasn't occurred. Now, there has been an increase in cold ischemia time, which you might think of as being logical because you're traveling further distances, but the increase in cold ischemia time has been quite modest. But there has been some consequences. There's no question that the transplant center costs have gotten higher under Share 35. We are getting to transplant the sicker patients, so the transplant centers are transplanting sicker patients. The medical system actually is benefiting because the MELD greater than 35 patients are being transplanted quicker. So they spend less days in the ICU, less cost, but that's not necessarily garnered by the transplant centers. The OPOs and transplant centers have also seen a huge increase in the number of flyouts that we have to go on. So it has gone from a small fraction to a much larger fraction in terms of how often we have to fly to go get a donor as opposed to drive. And this is an increase in the transportation logistics and the nightmare that we face in terms of getting a jet right away. In addition, we realize that some teams don't really play well in the sandbox. We were really subject to only the 3 centers that work with us in terms of Stanford and CPMC, and we in general, even though we're in competition, we work well together. When we expanded with Share 35 and had teams come in from UCLA, USC, et cetera, and I'm not going to mention who the bad actors are, but some teams don't really work well together. And we realize that there are different practices that we need to really be transparent about and really fix these things because as we go into wider regional distribution, we're going to have to work more and more together collaboratively as opposed to competitively. Other folks saw this, as usual, as an opportunity to game the system. The more transplant offers you get, well, guess what? You can accept 3 or 4 different livers for the same recipient now, and you can hold on to them for a long time and not tell the OPO, oh, by the way, I don't really want it for that patient, but I'll take it for the other patient that's lower down. And by the time the OPO gets around to trying to reallocate, they might not have time to reallocate to the next recipient. So we're now monitoring late declines, we're looking at late reallocations, and trying to hold centers responsible for being more transparent and more cooperative. So the Share 35 exposed certain things. center behavior, requiring more cooperation, more communication. We definitely need more transparency. And OPO doesn't even know that a transplant center has accepted 3 other offers from other DSAs and other OPOs outside their OPO. They know that whether their own OPO has offered a different liver from that for that center, but they don't know what other OPOs have. So we have to fix that. We need a much more agile allocation system. Right now, the donor net can only offer 3 centers at a time, any time for one specific donor, and that doesn't work when we have so many centers involved that could potentially get a liver. And the other thing that we've seen that the livers are traveling a long time, maybe unnecessarily, because one patient with a MELD of 39 is getting an offer and another MELD patient is getting 38, and they're very far apart. But it may be that 1 point in MELD difference may not be worth the huge expense of doing a flyout. So it could be that we might want to put in a system in place that the liver doesn't fly out of the local region unless it's for a MELD difference greater than 2 points or 3 points, something like that. But these are things that are sort of unintended consequences that we're trying to live with and trying to learn before we go on to larger redistricting. Now, just to repeat the final rule that has been in place, neither place of residence or place of listing shall be a major determinant of access to a transplant. Now, the problem with that is that when there are big disparities, there are people that have the resources to travel to an area that has low MELD. So if you're Steve Jobs, you go and buy a house in Tennessee, which he did, and you hang out at a center that has an average MELD of 22, and you get your transplant for neuroendocrine tumor. But what about everybody else that either can't move or don't have the resources to do it? Well, that means they have to hang around in our area where our average MELD score is 33 or 35, depending on the blood type, and then they have to get that sick or garner that many MELD points to get access to a liver, or they have to resort to living donor transplant, or they have to take the 90-year-old donor that comes up. So we have to look at how we measure disparity, and there are many ways to measure disparity. The main measure of disparity that we think of is what is the supply to demand ratio, but what is the actual supply? People argue, should we look at eligible deaths, potential deaths, all liver donors, all donors that can donate a liver, or just all deaths? And what's the demand part of that fraction? Should it just be all waitlisted patients, all patients with end-stage liver disease, whether they get referred or not to a transplant center? And then what are the metrics we should look at? We should maybe look at the variance in transplant rates across centers, or the variance in actually the organ offers, because organ acceptance practices are different, or variance in waitlist mortality at certain MELD, or drop-off rates off the MELD. We often use the variance in the MELD score to transplant because that is an indication of how sick you have to get in a certain area to get an offer or to get transplanted. And we can compare this to a single national list. A single national list is one in which the disparity is gone as much as you can. So if everyone's listed on a single national list, they're ordered according to the allocation scheme, but there's no borders. Now, that's actually relatively impractical. We're not going to fly to New England to go get a liver for a patient. But in terms of the single national list, we can compare the disparity of other systems with that disparity as actually the gold standard for decreasing disparity. And when we look at different models, we can think of both summative metrics over the whole country or some of the disparity metrics. For example, we can look at mortality at certain MELD scores over the whole country, and then look at disparity metrics and look at the range of these things across DSAs and across OPOs. I'll give you an example of that. In some DSAs, when you look at MELD patients with a MELD score of 38 to 39 points, in some DSAs, only 18% of those patients will die within 90 days. In other DSAs, 82% of those patients will die. And so that sort of variance is the kind of variance that I'm talking about when I say geographic disparity. Look at transplant MELDs, for example, and concentrate your area on how wide the whisker plot is at 36, 38, and 40. So in some areas of this country, you have an 18% chance of being transplanted a MELD of 38 to 39 within 90 days. Or like our place, and that on other places you have an 86% chance of receiving a liver transplant if you have that high a MELD score. And the same goes for waitlist deaths, for example. In some areas of this country, you only have a 14% of death, 14% chance of dying with a MELD score of 38 to 39, where other places in the country, you have an 82% chance of dying if you have a MELD score of 38 to 39. So what are the alternatives to the current system? Well, we're thinking about totally redrawing the map because the gerrymandering that has occurred to preserve the interests of certain transplant centers is really not serving the entire country. They may serve certain centers and certain groups of patients well in that they have it good, but the folks that have it bad have it really bad. So we looked at different districts using the OPO boundaries as a general guide to redistricting. We've looked at concentric circles around a donor hospital, getting rid of all lines, and again, comparing them to a single national list. And the way we compare every single design or map is called an LSAM model, kept by the SRTR. It's a liver simulation model of allocation policy changes. So you put in the optimization, put in new districts, and then look at the outcomes. Look at the summative outcomes, like how many patients get transplanted, what's the variance in MELD scores, what are the mortality on the wait list, et cetera. But the problem with some of the simulations is that there's many limitations of the modeling in that we can't really model changes in behavior. They're often quite impossible to predict. We don't think about how the centers might change their listing criteria or organ acceptance patterns because we can only model what's actually happening right now, so we keep that a constant when we model. And then OPO aggressiveness. Would some OPOs become more aggressive if placed under more pressure? So these are all very difficult to predict and impossible to include in the modeling. Now, what was the objectives of all these redistricting policies and proposals? Well, we wanted to reduce or minimize the total disparity of whatever disparity metric we chose. And one of them is the difference between the number of organs an area should have versus minus the organs that an organ region actually does have. And if you minimize the sum of these disparities across regions, that was a minimizing metric that the maps were created by Dori Segev's group, and they're subject to certain constraints put on them by the Liver Intestinal Committee. And some of these redistricting constraints that we put on them is, let's look at least 4 and no more than 8 districts and have a minimum number of centers or districts to be 6. And that the maximal travel time between DSAs in the same region to be 4 to 5 hours to try to minimize that additional cold ischemia time. And that we also said whatever model we come up with can't result in a higher number of total waitlist deaths, so that they have to be basically same or better than the current system. And so then we got all these outputs according to what maps we did: total deaths, waitlist less, transport times, how often you had to fly, transport distances, and how often an organ gets placed with a MELD greater than 25 patient. And again, the disparity metrics we looked at, the main one we looked at was the variance of MELD across transplant, across DSAs. So these are some of the sample maps. I showed you the 11 one. This was a map with 7 regions, for example, with a 3-hour transport constraint. And this is a 4-region map that would have us include Oregon, Washington, and Montana. And if you, no matter what one of these maps you designed, the geographic disparity went down by increasing the area of distribution. And in terms of very specific things, if you look at the last column, the standard deviation of your transplant MELD, the fewer the number of districts, the lower that deviation of the transplant MELD would be across DSAs. So if you look at the number of organs going to the quote-unquote wrong district, that is, going to a patient that has a lower MELD, that went down by a huge amount if you look at the current system compared to some of these redrawn maps. The other thing is, not only did the standard deviation of the transplant MELD go down according to the fewer number of districts in the first column, but if you look at the very last column, or if you look at the last column, you look at net waitlist deaths. These are lives that are saved within 5 years of invoking this. And this, I think, is a bottom number. It doesn't take into account other behavioral changes that might actually make this number higher. So you save approximately 600 lives in the span of 5 years by going to some of these other maps. There are some negative consequences. Note the percentage of the time that you would fly to go get an organ. And the median hours of transplant go up, but not by a huge amount. But the amount of flying goes up a huge amount, and that it's a huge increase in cost for the transplant venture itself. We compared to concentric circles and looking at allocation of 500 miles and then 1,000, and it was a very simple way of understanding it, but actually the problem is that this was not at all superior to the optimized maps that we just showed for decreasing disparity or for saving waitlist mortality. And so this is an example of what the existing geographic disparity is, divided up by quartiles of MELD. So the red areas are bad areas to live in. Those are the areas with the highest MELD score. With a different district map, this is a 4-district map that it looks at. Now, depressingly, California is still in the red. Now, it's actually less red than it is now, but the problem is that we would have to we would probably have to go to a 3-district map, which was constrained by our committee. We didn't want to look at. We may have to relook at this because California still remains an outlier. The rest of the country actually smooths out, and the disparity across DSAs in the whole country goes down quite a bit with the 4-district map. So what do we live in now? Right now, we live in a country with extremes where about a quarter of the U.S. population either lives in a DSA whose median MELDs are pretty high with a transplant MELD at greater than 29, or really low where the median MELD to transplant, again, the median MELD to transplant less than 20. Now, after redistricting, only 6% of the population would live in DSAs where median MELD scores are that extreme. So in summary, the implementation of the MELD score has largely fulfilled the sickest first notion, and we have not seen a huge decrease in overall outcomes. But significant geographic disparity still exists, and there are many barriers to going forward. If you can imagine the political will of the people that have it good right now, the haves do not want things to change. They want the status quo. They like having low MELD scores. They like having enough livers to go around for their patients. They do not want their MELD scores to go up. They don't want livers going to New York and California. In fact, they've told their U.S. congressmen that, and 52 U.S. congressmen have sent a letter to me and to the chair of the committee saying we're doing the wrong thing, and they're disappointed with how the direction that UNOS is going. So there are many political forces. To be frank, it's out of self-interest. I know they use their patients as their examples, but people are fearing their livelihood. The people are worrying about decreasing volumes, that their costs are going to go up because they're going to have to transplant sicker patients. There are also concerns about disparate OPO performances. Some OPOs do not perform as well as others. So one of the arguments is, all you're going to do is punish the good-performing OPOs and send organs to the poor-performing OPOs, and that's the reason for the organ disparity in terms of supply. It turns out that's also not the case. Most of the organ supply differences are made up because of death rates, not because of OPO performance. But there is definitely a difference in OPO performance, and it's a shame that Region 9, the New York OPO, actually is lower than expected in terms of their liver numbers. So that argument has some play. There's concerns about increasing distance and costs, and these are real. What's interesting, if you do an economic modeling of the new redistricting policies, it turns out there's a huge cost savings on the front end. In other words, the cost savings that you have when you get patients' livers early and they don't spend a month in the ICU on CVVHD or even don't go into renal failure, that's a huge savings for the entire medical system. Unfortunately, that savings is not garnered by the transplant center based on how we're reimbursed for cases. So somehow the medical system has to change such that the transplant centers are incentivized and actually rewarded for getting those patients done. Now, there are a lot of other concerns, other arguments against redistricting, against wider distribution. These are the forces that are going to be against us in terms of pushing forward. My commitment is real in terms of doing the right thing, and the guiding principles that we're going to go on is how do you save more lives, and that each life in this country is worth the same. In other words, a California life is worth saving as much as an Indiana life. So, it almost seems like the entire country is like an ABC country, anyone but California. But it turns out that our results, if you look at absolute results, we're just as good, if not better, than some of those centers that transplant at lower MELDs. And I mean completely non-risk adjusted results. If you look at our patient survival, look at our graft survival, we don't do poorly in terms of being stewards for the organs. So I would argue that there's stronger arguments for than against redistricting. So these are the forces that we are up against, and I just hope that we rise above the fray in terms of both provincial and other conflicting interests that sometimes have a very loud and vocal voice on both UNOS committees and in the U.S. Congress. So thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Rio, for a wonderful summary. And I realize why in these national meetings that people are mad at me being from UCSF for no particular reason. So, okay, so maybe I can ask you one quick question, unless you from the audience have others. So do you think that the challenge is really to demonstrate as a reduction in overall waitlist mortality for all these changes, and do you think that the data will be available?
I think the overall mortality may not go down a bit. I think the mortality at the higher MELDs will clearly go down with redistricting. The issue, though, I think, is we might have to come up with a model that favors at least a little bit the local centers. In other words, we don't necessarily want an organ to fly just for 1 or 2 MELD points. We want an organ to go out if there's really someone much sicker that can benefit that's not that close by. So I think if we have a system in which we favor the local distribution by 1 or 2 points, that may sort of both ameliorate the notion that the local centers won't have any access to those transplant organs that are coming locally, and yet get rid of this sort of provincial notion that every liver that originates in Wisconsin should always be offered to Wisconsin first, versus a neighbor in Minnesota who has usually, in general, a much sicker patient.
Okay. Oh yes, Mary Pat.
I favor the fewer districts, and I actually favor none of these maps. I favor a map in which the California area is a little bit larger than the current four district map, just being from California. I think to solve California, you actually have to probably go down to 3 districts, but to ameliorate the notion that these livers are going to fly huge distances, again, I would favor a system in which there's a circle around the donor that extends for 500 miles, let's say, and the local centers have some preference, not a huge, but some preference for that organ to be allocated to that center. And then it goes to the much larger area for the sickest patients, for example, the MELDs above 29, let's say. And that would be a system in which you increased organ access to the sickest patients, favor not flying organs around for really small MELD differences, and yet still equalize these organs. Those are things that we'll have to model to compare to these sort of computer-generated maps. Sometimes the computer generates maps based on allocation rules that we made, but the maps themselves don't make a lot of sense. The super region that California is located in the new map actually doesn't include Utah and Arizona, which actually is included in Region 5 just now currently. So that's one of the subtle things that I would argue that the 4-district map is something that I would not want to just adopt at this point. But anything's better than nothing. So even the 8-district map reduces disparity a huge amount compared to the DSA versus 11 UNOS regions that we have right now. Yes. It is. That is not what we're limited to do now. In fact, there's a lot of interesting misinformation going around saying, "Oh yeah, the Liver Intestinal Committee is ready to make a proposal," and everyone's up in arms about it. We had a one-day. I had 20 minutes just now. We had 8 hours of a session called the Liver Forum that we trotted out a lot of these concerns, and the Liver Intestinal Committee is really trying to address every single one of these concerns. Now, we're not going to come up with a policy that's going to be everyone's going to be happy with. I would say a third to a half of the country might be unhappy with me or our committee by the time we're done. But that doesn't bother me as long as we have a policy that is fair, that makes sense, and serves all of our patients well. And it's not just about California; it's about New York, it's about Minnesota, it's about Chicago, and those patients also suffer higher MELD scores than their neighbors right next door, compared to Wisconsin or Florida or wherever. And so I think that if we at least can come up with a reasonable set of guidelines that we all agree with, and sometimes even those are hard to agree with. The notion that an organ is a national resource, I thought that was a given because that's what HRSA thinks, that's what IOM thinks. Well, that's not what the rest of the country thinks. They don't agree with with that guiding principle that organs are a national resource. But at least we can all agree, or hopefully agree, that we want to save the largest number of patients we can with the scarce resources we have. So that's the kind of guiding principle I think that should really guide the discussion.
Okay. Thanks very much again, Rio.
at that status. So basically, it was a first come, first serve once you were in that status. In addition, geographic proximity took center stage because once you were in a category of 2B, they were ordered by waitlist time, but they were offered to the local area first before they went regionally. So the local area, and by local area, I mean an area that is determined by what's called the DSA, or the Donor Service Area of an organ procurement agency. As I'll show you, these lines don't make any sense. And actually, they do represent lines of death for many of our patients. In recent history, the U.S. Department of HHS actually published different final rules for the operation of the OPTN, and so changes were made to use the MELD score to allocate liver allografts, which is obviously a continuous score. And part of the final rules, these are the components, some of the components of the HHS final rules, that the allocation policy shall, 1, seek to achieve the best use of donated organs, 2, shall be designed to avoid wasting organs, to avoid futile transplants, to promote patient access to transplantation, and to promote the efficient management of organ placement. And importantly, shall not be based on a candidate's place of residence or place of listing. So I would submit we have failed on this last goal in a big way, and that we are trying our very best to try to meet this final rule, which has.
This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
I would like to introduce our next speaker as Dr. Ryutaro Hirose. I think some of you might remember Ryo, who had a masterful performance last year in the debate on HCC and kind of blow us off the planet, even though Neil Mehta and I had pretty good data. So that's the reason that Ryo is not doing a debate this year. Instead, Ryo is going to talk about fair organ allocation. It's a fitting topic for Ryo, as Ryo is serving as the Associate Director of UNOS and is going to be
allowed organs to end up in different centers. But the basic system was, first, it was offered to whatever local area that the liver occurred in. So whatever was closest, that center would have the first dibs on that organ. Then it went regionally, a little bit larger, then it went nationally, and they were listed in a very complex system of severity points, illness points, and points were actually, a fair number of points were added depending on the proximity of the donor to the transplant center. So the closest you were, you had more points, and this favored local use of the organ, which was a good thing in that it minimized cold ischemia time. But these point systems could be bypassed by any center saying, oh yeah, this is a UNO stat patient, I need a liver stat. And some centers used this frequently, others didn't, and so there was a disparity in where the organs actually went. Since that time, there was a distribution system that was in place for quite a long time where we only had 3 or 4 categories of patients. Status 1 was the acute liver failure patients. Status 2A and 2B were hospitalized patients either in the ICU or on the floor. And they were actually ordered according to things like ascites and encephalopathy, very subjective things. And so centers could sort of manipulate or game the system, put people in the ICU, all sorts of things. And there were many patients at the same status. So of all the patients at status 2B, how would they be ordered? Well, they would be ordered by waitlist time and some of the obstacles involved. But just as a little bit of a history lesson, the first successful liver transplant was done in 1967, and back then, in 1968, the Southeast Organ Procurement Foundation was formed as a membership and scientific organization for transplant professionals. And in 1977, 10 years later, they actually implemented the first computer-based organ matching system. They called it United Network for Organ Sharing that matched organs with recipients. 1984 was a hallmark year in that the U.S. Congress passed NOTA, noted as the National Organ Transplant Act, and then they established what's called the OPTN as a contractor to the government, the Organ Procurement and Transplant Network. And their role in the contract was to maintain, one, a national list of candidates, two, to establish a national system to match organs with the candidates, and to assist OPO's organ procurement agencies in the nationwide distribution of organs equitably among transplant patients. We'll get back to that word in just a second. In 1986, the UNOS, actually now separated completely from the Southeast Organ Procurement Foundation, is now a nonprofit member organization that receives the federal OPTN contract. And UNOS has actually held on to the contract ever since then. They've had several renewals, and they still remain the OPTN contractor. Now, originally, liver distribution was not a big deal in that there was very few liver transplant centers. As liver transplant centers grew, then there had to be a distribution system that...
The next UNOS director. So talking about debate, I'm sure that Rio has done very well in all these heated debates when it comes to national policies for organ allocation. So this is a really important topic, and Rio is really the best person to share this information with us. And just one other quick thing, that as if his plate is not full enough, he's also the Associate Surgical Residency Director, and he's a very active clinical surgeon as well, doing a lot of the HCC work for us, and it's been delightful to work with. So, Rio?
Just a slight correction, I don't direct all of UNOS. I'm just the vice chair of the Liver Intestinal Committee for UNOS. And so I will be involved, I'll be the upcoming chair of this committee. The role of the committee actually is to create organ allocation policy for this country for liver allografts and intestinal allografts. And it's an interesting committee to be on because there's a lot of representation from all over the world, all over the country. And obviously we have heated debates as to what is the right thing to do. Just the purpose of this presentation, I wanted to go over where we've been, where we are right now in terms of organ allocation distribution, and what the thinking of how to fix some of these problems that we have for the future.